For half a century, the Soviet Union was the largest threat to the United States. It was the only nation on Earth that can go head-to-head with the US, and depending on how exactly you compare them, even outmatch that of the US in some categories. In 1981, they had 3 times the active military manpower as the US, 5 times as many divisions, 4 times more tanks, 4 times more artillery, and more than 3 times as many attack submarines, among other areas which the Soviets led. In terms of technology, they also outmatched the US in some fields. This is something that most people do not know. In most areas, they were well behind the US, but according to a declassified US Department of Defense document, when it comes to applied technology, they believe there were 35 areas of technology the US was currently leading in, while the Soviet Union was superior in another 28 areas. The fear was that in the future, the Soviets would surpass the US, leading in 40 areas compared to the US in 23. Specific technologies mentioned include intercontinental ballistic missiles with cold launch capabilities, cold launched meaning that they do not ignite their rocket motor to leave the launcher, mobile air defenses such as Buck, satellite interception technology, rocket artillery, and others. However, this all came to a pretty sudden end. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, military spending plummeted. In 1988, defense spending was around $250 billion, adjusted for inflation. By 1992, it was $40 billion, and continued to fall for the rest of the 90s, reaching a low of just $13 billion in 1998, a decline of nearly 95%. Russia, being the main successor state to the Soviet Union, inherited the vast majority of the Soviet Union's military, but struggled to maintain it. The economy of Russia was extremely rough in the 90s and even into the early 2000s. They had a superpowers military, built to fight the US across the globe, but no money to support it. Thousands upon thousands of nuclear weapons, tanks, aircraft, hundreds of ships and submarines, and countless more weapons began to suffer the effects of budget cuts, with some deteriorating past the point of ever being repaired. Toward the end of the decade, the Russian defense budget hit its low point, at only 5% of what it had been just 10 years earlier. Several attempts at reforming the Russian military were tried and failed. Things slowly did begin to turn around though. Russia's economy began a slow but steady rise after 1998, and really began to grow during the mid-2000s. Another major factor for the increase in the Russian armed forces was the expansion of NATO. In 1999, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland joined. Then in 2004, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovenia, and Slovakia joined NATO. Most of these countries were either part of the Soviet Union or at least part of the Warsaw Pact that was created directly to counter NATO during the Cold War. This expansion united a Russia that was still torn between how to reform and structure the old Soviet army. Since that low in 1998, Russian defense spending has continued to rise nearly every year, from $13 billion to nearly $70 billion today. With the rise in military spending, Moscow has been contemplating on how best to spend it. Nearly every facet of their military required massive investments. Their nuclear forces were in horrible shape, many submarines and ships left rusting in port, same with tanks and aircraft. And on top of that, the technology used was dated, mostly all going back at least 2 decades to the 1980s, and a lot even older. In 2008, a massive military reform program was launched. Active personnel was cut down to 1 million. Much of the cuts were to officers, which were cut by over 60%. The Air Force was cut down from 245 active air bases to only 52. The ground forces cut the number of military units and formations from nearly 2,000 to 172. And the Russian Navy was cut nearly in half, from 240 individual units to 123. These reforms help better focus spending and making organizing much more manageable. With this done, Moscow planned to invest over 1 trillion rubles over the next 10 years into buying new or modernizing old equipment, with the goal of reaching 70% modernization by the year 2020. And being that it is now nearly 2020, Russia has accomplished a lot. This decade, they have built more than 100 ICBMs, 100 submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and 3 new ballistic missile subs to fire them from, 7 attack submarines, 20 S-400 regiments, 23 Pantsir regiments, over 3,000 tanks and armored vehicles, over 4 dozen military satellites, 161 naval vessels, and more than 1,000 aircraft. Along with these are thousands of new UAVs, and increased their cruise missile arsenal by 30 times what it had been. Russia has undoubtedly come a great distance from the mid-1990s, when they could barely feed their troops. The Russian Navy is a notable case in this modernization program. Plans were made to build 100 new ships by 2020, including destroyers, corvettes, frigates, submarines, and even aircraft carriers. There are many projects being worked on, too many to adequately cover, but the aircraft carrier plans are the most interesting. Right now, Russia has one, the Admiral Kuznetsov, an old, often inoperable steam-powered aircraft carrier, which recently experienced new problems with the sinking of the PD-50 in which it was being repaired in. Many plans have been made to create new carriers, all of which have seemingly been cancelled, or at least postponed indefinitely. Another interesting project is the new Leader-class destroyer. The specs of the destroyer are pretty impressive, possibly being nuclear-powered, stealthy characteristics to make detection more difficult. It is planned to be significantly larger than the US Arleigh-Burke-class destroyers. Plans to carry over 100 cruise missiles, both anti-ship and land attack, including future hypersonic missiles, and several dozen air defense missiles to defend itself. Planning for this new class of destroyer began in the 90s, with real work and funding beginning in 2013. However, timetables for completion have started to slip. The finished design has still not been finalized, at least not publicly, and Russian state-run media organization TASS has recently reported that the first 2 Leader-class ships will not be built until the end of the 2020s. The Russian Air Force has also seen some major upgrades and new systems, most famously being the Su-57 stealth fighter jet. It has been in development for over a decade, with its roots tracing all the way back to the late 70s. One precursor was the Su-47, a strange forward-swept wing design that was soon cancelled, but can interestingly enough still be seen parked at the Zhukovsky International Airport. The fighter jet also sports some pretty incredible capabilities, such as obviously stealth, super maneuverability, super cruise, which is the ability to fly supersonic without afterburner, a modern AESA radar, and more. The Su-57 program has had its difficulties though. Many setbacks have occurred. One major partner in the program, India, pulled out due to issues, which made Russia the sole source of funding for the project. Also, issues with engines, avionics, among other technical issues, have reportedly delayed production of the aircraft, although these things are common when building brand new, state-of-the-art weapon systems. Look at the F-35 for example, or any other 5th generation aircraft. However, more signs have appeared that there are issues with the aircraft. Procurement has been repeatedly cut back, from 160 to 70, then 55, and finally recently announced that they would only procure 12 Su-57s. The main reason for the cutback is not clear. It could be technical issues, rising cost, or a combination of both. Russia's Deputy Defense Minister, Yuri Borisov, stated in 2018 that they would not be mass-producing the aircraft, stating specifically that the Su-57 is the best aircraft in the world, and therefore will not make sense mass-producing it. He also stated that Russia should focus on developing and funding future 6th generation aircraft for the future, instead of the 5th generation Su-57. Also, the Russian ground forces have seen modernization as well, a major system being the T-14 Armata main battle tank. On paper, the T-14 is a great tank, an extremely powerful and accurate 125mm main gun, reactive armor, and an active protection system to defend itself, and many improvements in technology such as communications, sensors, an unmanned turret, and fire control systems. But like previously mentioned systems, the Armata has had many of its own problems. It famously broke down during a rehearsal for the Victory Day parade in 2015 and had to be towed away. Initial plans called for over 2,000 tanks to be built by the end of the decade. This, however, has been delayed officially to 2025. Then, in a move similar to that of the Su-57, Yuri Borisov stated that, again, that the T-14 Armata is unnecessary to mass produce, as older tanks are good enough, which again indicates possible problems with the tank, such as rising costs, which could mean that the T-14 will not be produced in any major numbers, at least not anytime soon. There have also been other major, state-of-the-art projects that are being developed and supposedly tested, like the 3M-22 Zircon, a hypersonic anti-ship missile that will be launched from naval ships like the Kirov class, and the S-500, a missile defense system similar to the American THAAD. Russia claims both have been tested several times, yet has not released any footage or even any pictures of anything besides mock-ups. As I stated, there are many projects and new systems Russia has designed and built in recent years. Far too many for me to cover. This topic could easily be made into a full 10-part documentary series. But Russia has also started to be more assertive on the world stage. They are now the second largest exporter of weapons, and have been getting involved militarily in countries such as Venezuela, Ukraine, and most notably, Syria. In Syria, Russia has taken lease and built up a major air base in Latakia, and a naval base at Taurus. Syria has, in a way, become a proving ground where they are able to test their newest weapons in combat. 3 Su-57s were deployed shortly in Syria, reportedly firing missiles. A few S-400 surface-to-air missile systems have been set up there, along with shorter-range systems like Pantsir and Tor. And they have also launched Caliber and Kh-55 cruise missiles at enemy targets, showing off their ability to hit targets from several hundred kilometers away. Russia has also expanded the number and size of military exercises. Recently, Vostok 2018 was held with China, which was labeled by the media as the biggest war game since the fall of the Soviet Union, with several 100,000 troops, over 1,000 aircraft, and 2 naval fleets participating. Russia has even begun to encroach on NATO and historical US allies by selling weapons to countries such as Turkey and Saudi Arabia. Much of the progress of the Russian armed forces can be attributed to Vladimir Putin, who served as president from 2000 till 2008, and then again beginning in 2012, after being ineligible to run during the 2008 presidential election. Putin has pushed for major overhauls, reforms, and modernization programs throughout his presidency. In 2018, he announced several brand new, high-tech, for lack of better words, super weapons. Hypersonic weapons, nuclear-powered cruise missiles, and even a nuclear-powered torpedo, armed with reportedly a 100 or even 200 megaton nuclear warhead, which Russia claims would cause massive tsunamis, called Poseidon, or Status 6. The purpose of these weapons are all the same: to penetrate the newer and more capable US missile defense systems, such as THAAD and GMD. While Putin claimed that these weapons were nearly operational, that is likely not the case, some of which seem to be experiencing major problems, such as the nuclear-powered cruise missile. It appears that every test that we know about has failed, the most successful only flying some 35 kilometers, despite having a virtually unlimited range. Recently, more reports have come out, such as rising cost and technical issues which may delay the program by at least a decade, and possibly indefinitely. Satellite imagery of the site in Novaya Zemlya show vehicles and ships removing structures and equipment, perhaps meaning that they are no longer going to be testing the weapon. Russia is more secretive though, very rarely revealing information, especially if it is negative, such as a failed test. But, as I discussed, many of these new projects have been facing some serious problems, beyond the typical issues that arise with brand new weapons. But another major issue is still funding. Despite defense spending being many times more than it was in the 1990s, in recent years the budget has seemed to peak and even decline. A major issue is that Russia's economy is still largely tied to the price of energy. Energy exports, such as oil and natural gas, make up more than half of all Russian exports. So any change in the price of these products have a pretty substantial impact on Russia. Oil prices plummeted a few years ago, from nearly $110 per barrel in 2014 to less than $30 in early 2016, a massive 75% drop. As a result, the Russian economy suffered. The ruble plummeted from 34 rubles to equal $1 to 83 in January 2016. And the ruble is still not fully recovered, even to this day. At the time of making this video, it's sitting at 65.5. Another possible issue for Russia in the future is China. Right now, Russia and China are close. China is one of Russia's largest customers when it comes to weapons sales. But with China continuing to grow, along with its own domestic defense industry, Russia may soon be competing against China in the arms trade. China has also copied many of Russia's weaponry, most under license, but not always. The J-11 is a Chinese licensed version of Russia's Su-27, and under the agreement, China was not allowed to develop an aircraft carrier variant of the plane, but China did, creating the J-15, based on the Russian Su-33. And Russia had actually refused to sell China the Su-33 after they found out that China was building an unlicensed aircraft called the J-11B. So there are small cracks already present in their relations which have the potential to worsen. Also, as China continues to grow and expand its influence, its close proximity with Russia could cause tensions. A similar thing has happened in the past. China and the Soviet Union originally shared a pretty close relationship in the early years of the Cold War. However, that changed pretty quickly with the Sino-Soviet split in the 1960s. Tensions between the two skyrocketed, and the possibilities of nuclear war between the once close allies became a real possibility. So Russia has undoubtedly come a far way since the early 90s. I think further than many in the West want to give them credit for. But it still remains to be seen what the future will hold for the Russian military. Also, before you go, check out the Commando store. They're an online military surplus store. They have everything: jackets, pants, boots, shirts, gloves, hats, tools, patches, stickers, and many more. Most of their inventory is either Cold War or later era, so there's some pretty cool stuff there, like this East German bayonet. One big seller for them has been the Swiss KS90 boots. They come with a warranty and free sizing exchanges as well. Or this custom Russian-made Gorka mountain suit here. Lots of cool stuff. I have the link in the description. Go on over and check out the site, see what they have. They accept returns, have great customer service, and on top of that, you get an extra 5% off if you mention this ad using the code COVERT at checkout. They also ship internationally, so go check them out. Again, that is the Commando store, commando.com. And finally, for those who are still around, I'm making a podcast with King Neptune, the founder of R Submarines on Reddit. As of recording this, we already have 3 finished, but haven't released any of them yet. We're still working on some of the details, but we should have them out before the end of April. I have a link to the currently empty YouTube channel, which is one of the places we will be uploading to, in the description here. So check that out, maybe subscribe so that you'll be notified when they are released. We have a lot of cool plans, topics, and guests to interview, so I'm really excited to get the ball rolling on that.